Hi, everybody. So today we're going to read the second part of Call of the Wild, Chapter 1, Part 2. So I'm going to pull up the PDF. Let's see. Hold on a second. Now, this should match the document that you have in the file, and I'm going to try to make it full screen so that we can read along together. Miss Schneeberger was really nice, and she added notes on the side margins, so that'll help facilitate things for you and make it easier for you to understand. Okay, so this is what happens though when I go to full screen is that I lose the video. So I think I might have to do it on the smaller screen. So I apologize for that, but I think we're going to have to do it this way the best that we can. Um, all right, so before we get started, when we read the first part of chapter 1, Buck starts out and he's living in this wonderful circumstance where he's treated like complete royalty. And a lot of you might be able to relate to that. You might have that dog at home who everybody loves to tears and they get treats all the time and special treatment. Um, if you have one of those dogs or situations, just think about if they were just kidnapped and suddenly brutally thrown into like a ship and sent up to the wilderness to become a sled dog. They would not respond well to it. It would be a traumatic event, and I think it's something that we could all like put our feet into a little bit. All right, so before we start reading today, one of the things you're going to want to do is think about how much Buck has changed since he was at the judge's farm. All right, he is not the same dog. He starts off, he's trustworthy. He's willing to go with Emmanuel, even though Emmanuel has bad motives because he's been trained to trust humans. And think about all the things that have happened along the way that suddenly he's not going to trust people as much anymore and be much more fearful. So one of the things we might be able to do here is let's just make that a little bit bigger and try to read along the best you can. All right, chapter 1, part 2, Call the Wild by Jack London. So where we left off, Buck had seen his first snow and is now in a completely different environment. So 4 men gingerly carried the crate from the wagon into a small, high-walled backyard. A stout man with a red sweater that sagged generously at the neck came out and signed the book for the driver. That was the man that Buck divined, the next tormentor, and he hurled himself savagely against the bars. The man smiled grimly and brought a hatchet and a club. "You ain't gonna take him out now," the driver said. "Sure," the man replied, driving the hatchet into the crate for a pry. There was an instantaneous scattering of the 4 men who had carried it in, and from safe perches on top the wall, they prepared to watch the performance. Now, this is going to be the part where, look, Buck's going to either live or die. They're not going to work with a savage dog. We all know this. The decision that Buck makes next is going to affect his entire future. And we all know that he's angry. He hasn't been drinking. He hasn't been eating. Buck rushed at the splintering wood, sinking his teeth into it, surging and wrestling with it. Wherever the hatchet fell on the outside, he was there on the inside, snarling and growling, as furiously anxious to get out as the man in the red sweater was calmly intent on getting him out. "Now, you red devil," he said, and when he had made an opening sufficient for the passage of Buck's body, and at the same time he dropped the hatchet and shifted the club to his right hand. Now, poor Buck, they're not just regularly taking him out of the crate, they're chopping the crate with a hatchet to get him out, which is just going to heighten the tension of the moment and heighten things for Buck. And the guy's got a club in his hand. And Buck was truly a red-eyed devil. As he drew himself together for the spring, hair bristling, mouth foaming, a mad glitter in the bloodshot eyes, straight at the man he launched his 140 pounds of fury, surged from the pent passion of 2 days and nights, and in midair, just as his jaws were about to close on the man, he received a shock that checked his body and brought his teeth together in an agonizing clip. He whirled over, fetching the ground on his back and side. He had never been struck by a club in his life, and he did not understand. With his snarl that was part bark and more scream, he was again on his feet and launched into the air, and again the shot came, and he was brought crushingly to the ground. This time he was aware that it was the club, and his madness knew no caution, and a dozen times he charged, and often the club broke the charge and smashed him down. after a particularly fierce blow. He crawled to his feet, too dazed to rush, staggered limply about, the blood flowing from nose and mouth and ears, his beautiful coat sprayed and flecked with a bloody slaver. Then the man advanced and deliberately dealt him a frightful blow on the nose, and all the pain he had endured was as nothing compared to the exquisite agony of this. And with a roar that was almost lion in its ferocity, he again hurled himself at the man, but the man, shifting the club from right to left, coolly caught him by the underjaw, and at the same time, wrenching downward and backward, Buck described a complete circle in the air and half of another, then crashed to the ground on his head and chest. For the last time he rushed, the man struck the shrewd blow he had purposely withheld for so long, and Buck crumpled up and went down, knocked utterly senseless. Now, one of the things that we have to think about right now is that Buck has never experienced anything like this. Buck has not been subjected to any kind of violence, any kind of anger. He's lived this like fairy tale existence. So, one of the things you have to think about is character development. How is this going to affect Buck going forward? He's never been hit before. At some point, he smartly decides he just can't do it anymore to back down, because if he hadn't, they definitely were going to take him out. So let's keep reading and see what happens. "He's no slouch at dog breaking, that's what I say," one of the men on the wall cried enthusiastically. "Druther break Caius any day and twice on Sundays," was the reply of the driver as he climbed on the wagon and started the horses. Buck's senses came back to him, but not his strength. He lay where he had fallen, and from there he watched the man in the red sweater. This section right here, just to remind you that this is dialect. We discussed this when we read the anti-lynching plays, and with dialect, one of the things you see is that they speak the way they talk, and these people are not as educated as people you would see today. So there's a lot of slang, and just work your way through the best you can. Okay, so at least we see right here that Buck's going to get to keep his name. So, answers to the name of Buck, the man soliloquized, quoting from the salon keeper's hand, which had announced the consignment of the crate and the contents. "Well, Buck, my boy," he went on in a genial voice, "we've had our little ruction, and the best thing we can do is to let it go at that. You've learned your place, and I know mine. Be a good dog, and we'll all go out and goose hang high. Be a bad dog, and I'll whale the stuffing out of you. Understand?" As he spoke fearlessly, patted the head he had so mercilessly pounded, and through Buck's involuntary and though Buck's hair involuntarily bristled at touch of the hand, he endured it without protest. And when the man brought him water, he drank eagerly. Remember how thirsty he is. And later bolted a generous meal of raw meat, chunk by chunk, from the man's hand. One of the things you see here as, and I'll just actually continue reading, he was beaten, he knew that, but he was not broken. He saw once and for all that he stood no chance against a man with a club. He had learned the lesson, and in all of his life, he never forgot that. The club was a revelation. It was his introduction to the reign of primitive law, and he met the introduction halfway. The facts of life took on a fiercer aspect, and while he faced the aspect uncowed, he faced it with all the latent cunning of his nature aroused. And as the days went by, the other dogs came in, crates at the end of ropes came docilely, and some raging and roaring as he had come, and one and all, he watched them pass under the dominion or power of the man in the red sweater. Again and again, as he looked at each brutal performance, the lesson was driven home to Buck. A man with a club was a lawgiver, a master to be obeyed, though not necessarily conciliated. On his of this last, Buck was never guilty, though he had seen beaten dogs that fawned upon the man and wagged their tails and licked his hands. Also, he saw one dog that would neither conciliate nor obey, finally killed in the struggle for mastery. So, some of the things we see here now is that if the dogs are not willing to submit to the men, then they're put to their death. So, one of the things that Buck learns is, even though he hates it and he has to give up a lot of his dignity, he has to cower to this man to some degree. Not the way these other dogs are, where they're like crawling and begging. He still has some sense of pride intact. So he's uncowed or with courage. Conciliated means stopped or pacified, and wheedlingly means flatteringly or trying to persuade. So he's not going to kiss the man's, kiss up to the man and try to get him to like love him. He's going to remain himself and be respectful without begging. Yet at the same time, in the end, in the form of a little weazened man, which means wrinkled, like a little old guy, who spat broken English and many strange and uncouth exclamations which Buck could not understand. Sacredom, he cried, where his eyes lit upon Buck. Dat one damn bully dog, eh, how mooch? 300 and a present at that, was the prompt reply of the man in the red sweater. And seem it's government money. Ain't no kick coming, eh, Perot? Perot grinned, considering that the price of the dog had been boomed skyward by the unwanted demand. This is because the gold rush is going on. One of the only ways to access these territories in the north is through dog sledding, as you learned last week with the dog sledding lessons that you had. So, in any case, the government is paying big money for good dogs because they need them to go track down this gold. The Canadian government would be no loser, nor would its dispatches travel the slower. Perot knew dogs, and when he looked at Buck, he knew that he was 1 in 1,000. 1 in 10,000, he commented mentally. Buck saw money pass between them and was not surprised when Curly, a good-natured Newfoundland, and he were led away by the little weazened man. That was the last he saw of the man in the red sweater, and as Curly and he looked at receding Seattle, that's in Washington State, from the deck of the Narwhal, that's a ship, it was the last he saw of the warm Southland, that's California. Curly and he were taken below by Perot and turned over to a black-faced giant named Francois. Perot was a French Canadian and swarthy. Swarthy just means that he has dark skin. But Francois was a French Canadian half breed and twice as swarthy. They were a new kind of men to Buck, of which he was destined to see many more. And while he developed no affection for them, he nonetheless grew honestly to respect them, and he speedily learned that Perot and Francois were fair men, calm and impartial to administering justice, and too wise in the ways of dogs to be fooled by dogs. In the tween decks of the Narwhal, okay, now we're going to learn about Spitz. Spitz is like Buck's nemesis, okay? In this next chapter, you're going to see he's like manipulative, and one of those people that they do something, but then when you try to retaliate, you get in trouble for it. So I don't think you're going to like Spitz. All right. In the tween decks of the Narwhal, Buck and Curly joined 2 other dogs. One of them was a big snow-white fellow from Spitzenberg, who had been brought along by a whaling captain who had later accompanied a geological survey into the Barrens. He was friendly in a treacherous sort of way, smiling into one's face the whole while he meditated some underhand trick. As for instance, when he stole from Buck's food at the first meal, as Buck sprang to punish him, the lash of Francois's whip sang through the air, reaching the culprit first, and nothing remained to Buck but to recover the bone. That was the fare of Francois, he decided, and the half-breed began to rise in Buck's estimation. Buck's estimation, excuse me. So at this point, Buck begins to have a fair respect of Francois, because Francois at this point sticks up for him. The other dog made no advances, nor received any. Also, he did not attempt to steal from the newcomers. He was a gloomy, morose fellow, and he showed Curly plainly that all he desired was to be left alone, and further, that there would be trouble if he was not left alone. Dave. Dave is the moody loner dog. Dave, as he was called, and he slept and ate or yawned between times and took interest in nothing, not even when the Narwhal crossed Queen Charlotte Sound and rolled and pitched and bucked like a thing possessed. When Buck and Curly grew excited, half wild with fear, hold on 1 sec, I need 2 more minutes. Shh, I'm recording something, 2 more minutes. Sorry. Family upstairs. Not even when the Narwhal crossed Queen Charlotte Sound and rolled and pitched and bucked like a thing possessed. But when Buck and Curly grew excited, half wild with fear, he raised his head as though annoyed, favored them with an incurious glance, yawned, and went to sleep again. Day and night the ship throbbed to the tireless pulse of the propeller, and though one day was very like another, it was apparent to Buck that the weather was steadily growing colder, and at last, one morning when the propeller was quiet and the Narwhal was pervaded with an atmosphere of excitement, he felt it, as did the other dogs, and knew that the change was at hand. Francois leashed them and brought them on the deck, and at the first step upon the cold surface, Buck's feet sank into the white mushy something, very like mud, and he sprang back with a snort. More of this white stuff was falling through the air. He shook himself, and more of it fell. Oh, all right. So now I'm realizing that I mistakenly told you about the snow at the beginning of the chapter. But all right, so this is actually the first time that he experiences snow. Apologies for the beginning. So one of the things that's nice here is that there's always moments of wonder and beauty, even at the cruelest moment. So he comes off of this ship, he's with this whole new tribe of dogs, and he steps into snow. What is more beautiful than that in this dark moment of his life? All right, so at this point, you have 3 attempts. I want you to go on and take the online quiz. For the matching, you have to click on the little line and then just enter A, B, C, D. Play around with it. You should be able to figure it out. And I hope you're enjoying the book. This is one of the books we hadn't planned on reading this year, but I happen to love. So enjoy. I hope you guys have a great rest of the week. Love you all, Miss Moskowitz.